February 21st, 1972. The exchange of toasts between Richard Nixon and China's Premier Zhou Enlai, longtime enemies whose governments did not even recognize each other, was a foreign policy breakthrough that dazzled the world. It was the high watermark of the Nixon presidency.
If there was a postscript that I hope might be written with regard to this trip, it would be the words on the plaque which was left on the moon by our first astronauts when they landed there. We came in peace for all mankind.
But then, a mere 4 months later, on June 17th, 1972, a different kind of event took place in Washington at a location that soon became a household word, Watergate. What the White House called a third-rate burglary gradually evolved into a first-rate crisis that would ultimately drive Nixon from office. Diplomacy and conspiracy, the two sides of Richard Nixon's presidency on this edition of the 20th century. I'm Mike Wallace. Through the lens of history, it's hard to recall just how isolated communist China was from the United States in 1972. There were no diplomatic relations, no trade, no travel, nothing. Most Americans at that time knew next to nothing about China or the Chinese. Offensive ethnic stereotypes and simplistic cliches were commonplace. As Charles Corral pointed out in a controversial broadcast on the eve of the president's journey to China.
No tikkie, no washi. One from column A and one from column B and a fortune cookie. You'll be hungry an hour later. That is about as much as we know about the Chinese. They are a race apart from any other foreigners, Italians or English or French, and a long way apart from us.
In that climate, a visit to China by any American president would have been a stunner. What made Richard Nixon's trip singular was that he was a man who had climbed to the pinnacle of political power based in no small measure on his militant anti-communism. Richard Nixon had been a congressman for almost 3 years when China fell to Mao Zedong's Red Army. Mao's peasant army overwhelmed the forces of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, a longtime friend of the United States.
In December 1949, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalist government flee to the independent island of Formosa, 100 miles from the China mainland.
Under President Eisenhower and his Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, Washington refused to recognize Mao's China. A kind of U.S. curtain had descended over China.
A great wall separates both nations. A wall of ignorance and suspicion built in equal parts by Peking and Washington.
It was the Vietnam War that altered forever the dynamics between China, the United States, and the Soviet Union. We knew the Chinese were supplying arms to the North Vietnamese. We thought the Chinese were using the North Vietnamese as surrogates to expand Chinese control over Southeast Asia. But the reality was far different.
Never before, surely, has there been a country quite the way China is today. 700 million people are on the way to thinking the thoughts of a single man. Whether they do it through fear or belief matters little. 700 million minds are being replaced by this red book, the thoughts of Chairman Mao Zedong.
By 1968, the United States was bogged down in Vietnam. It was an election year. The climate was ripe for new ideas, new approaches. And Richard Nixon sensed the changed mood as he made his second run for the White House.
There was much talk of a new Nixon, different from the hard-hitting partisan of the 1940s and 50s.
I covered the Nixon campaign in 1968, and I well remember a cryptic remark he made to me on the night of his acceptance speech at the Republican convention. As he made his way to the podium, I happened to mention to him that I'd be leaving the campaign to begin a new broadcast called 60 Minutes. That's too bad, he said. You're going to miss some great trips. Only much later did it occur to me that even then, before his election, That historic journey to China was on his mind. But before there could be any movement toward China, Nixon, as president, had to do something about his major foreign policy problem, Vietnam.
Out of a series of White House strategy sessions during the early weeks of 1969, there emerged the concept of Vietnamization. In essence, it called for the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops over an extended period of time and the beefing up of South Vietnamese forces. And the new president further hoped that such a policy would lead, rather quickly, to a negotiated settlement.
Even if it didn't lead to an early settlement, the fact of beginning the withdrawal of U.S. troops from Vietnam in 1969 did open the way to a possible trip to China. And from the Chinese side, increasing signs of a willingness to be courted. In 1971, a touring U.S. ping-pong team was invited to China.
It had been quite a tea party. Joe and I had taken 2 hours to talk to the table tennis players, and among all the pleasantries, the message came out loud and clear. China wants better relations with the United States.
It was the signal the White House had been waiting for. On July 15, 1971, President Nixon stunned the nation by announcing he would go to China early the next year.
I have taken this action because of my profound conviction that all nations will gain from a reduction of tensions and a better relationship between the United States and the People's Republic of China.
President Nixon's arrival in Beijing the morning of February 21st was like letting the sunshine into a room that had been in total darkness for almost 25 years. His arrival at 11:30 a.m. Beijing time was precisely scheduled to coincide with television prime time in the United States. Just one example of how carefully choreographed the trip was to get maximum television coverage back home during an election year.
And there's Mrs. Nixon and the President. We do not hear the band striking up. President Nixon applauding. This is the Chinese style, to applaud back when one is applauded and greeted. And there is Zhou Enlai, first handshake with Zhou Enlai.
The first day brought this trip's first surprise. Within 4 hours of his arrival, President Nixon was meeting with the 78-year-old political and spiritual leader of this nation, Chairman Mao Zedong. Because of his meeting with Mao, President Nixon was late for his first private talk with Premier Zhou Enlai at the Great Hall of the People. The President arrived in the cold without topcoat, looking as though he was in no particular hurry. The first day's social highlight was the banquet in the Great Hall of the People. There, the entire American entourage, newsmen and White House staff was invited, and there were Chinese counterparts, artists, editors, doctors, to swell the feasting crowd to 750 or so. The band was from the Central Military District of Peking, but the melody for it was just a touch on the exotic side. And they hung on the words of the toast for a clue to the temperature of the talk.
We hope that through a frank exchange of views between our two sides, to gain a clearer notion of our differences and make efforts to find common ground, a new start can be made in the relations between our two countries.
Seize the day. Seize the hour. This is the hour. This is the day for our two peoples to rise to the heights of greatness which can build a new and a better world.
It's now Tuesday evening in Peking, and President Nixon is winding up the second day of his visit to China. Compared to the hectic round of events that followed the president's arrival, today's schedule was much less crowded, although there was another formal meeting this afternoon between Mr. Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai.
There are very few details being given about any of these talks, but this much does seem clear. A wide range of issues is being discussed. That's what President Nixon had hoped for.
As for Mrs. Nixon, she has now started out on her own personal adventures in China.
The First Lady drove to the Peking Zoo for a glimpse of the pandas native only to China's Sichuan province. Zhou Enlai has indicated that he'll ship 2 of these rare animals to the United States in exchange for the musk oxen that President Nixon has said he's going to present to the Chinese to add to the more than 4,000 animals in this extraordinary botanical and zoological garden.
It's now, of course, nighttime in Peking, and President and Mrs. Nixon are now attending a ballet. The ballet is the Red Detachment of Women.
The play itself, the ballet, is not anti-imperialist as such. It's anti-counter-revolutionary, so the president could applaud politely whether or not he actually liked the performance. Good evening. The talks between President Nixon and Premier Zhou Enlai continue behind closed doors.
While the formal talks went on, the Chinese eagerly showed off their country, and the newsmen were just as eager to see it.
This division headquarters clearly is an Army showplace. The visitor gets the standard lecture from the commanding officer. He proudly details the fact that this division killed 38,000 enemies since it was formed in 1937, not an inconsiderable portion when its members volunteered to fight in Korea. The commander, Kang Yu-chi, told me over a splendid lunch with innumerable toasts that he too fought in Korea, and he found American firepower very good, American fighting not so good. That's the way he put it. And it isn't the cold wind and swirling snow that sends the chill up one's spine here, but the knowledge that the smiling faces and gracious hospitality of our hosts here cannot disguise the fact that the weapons they are so proudly displaying have taken uncounted numbers of American lives in Korea and Southeast Asia.
To eyes that had not been inside China in almost a quarter century, everything was fascinating.
Of all the changes in China wrought by Mao's revolution, none stands more chance of outliving him than changes in the status of women. You walk the streets of Peking several days, studying the women closely, and you cannot miss the contrasts. There are old women everywhere with feet painfully crippled from foot binding. Binding a female's feet at birth ensured the economic and physical dependence of women, and to the Chinese male mind of not so long ago, tiny broken feet were considered erotic. Those days are gone forever, whether the rest of Mao's revolution survives or not.
President Nixon has taken a break in the rhythm of his negotiations to become a tourist in China for the first time. The Chinese, excellent hosts, laid on the Great Wall, about 2,500 miles of elevated stone, dating back some 2,500 years.
At one point he walked along a ramp running off from the main section at a 90-degree angle to get a better view. On the way back to his car, Mr. Nixon stopped to chat with newsmen.
As we look at this wall, we do not want walls of any kind between peoples. And I think one of the results of our trip, we hope, may be that the walls that are erected, whether they are physical walls like this or whether they are other walls of ideology or philosophy, will not divide peoples in the world.
While the talks continued, so did the side trips. Side trips that included previously forbidden glimpses of Chinese life.
Political commissars with little or no formal medical training oversee each hospital and the whole medical college. Such politicized control, the communists claim, has been partly responsible for what they call China's national health miracle. This includes the alleged miracle of acupuncture. The Chinese this day converted a large group of U.S. journalists, including many who came, despite previous publicity, as doubters, into believers. Reporters and photographers were appropriately dressed, then shown 4 separate surgical operations and 3 tooth extractions, all done under acupuncture anesthesia. Example, 36-year-old woman, cesarean section childbirth. Small needles placed inside of her legs, larger needles higher. Mild electrical shock is applied through some of the needles, an amount roughly equal to that from a couple of flashlight batteries. 20 minutes later, surgery begins. The baby is out. It's alive. It's a girl. Mother and child doing fine. And if what we have seen and heard here during the past 45 minutes is as it was presented to us, and it certainly appeared to be, then there's only one word to describe it. Amazing.
It is tomorrow morning, right now in Peking, on the other side of the world, and the President and Mrs. Nixon spent part of it touring in a snowstorm the splendors of the old Forbidden City, the ancient seat of the Chinese emperors.
We can see just from here thousands and thousands of people, young people, both boys and girls, somewhat older people, but mostly young, mobilized to combat this rather ordinary, rather gentle snowstorm that's been falling on Peking last night and this morning. What they do if the snow just keeps falling, you can guess. They just keep working. Maybe another shift of another 10 or 20,000 will show up. But this has staggered us all. I don't know whether they know that they're being watched by foreigners or not. I don't think most of them do. This is the way it's done. The order or the request comes down. There's no question of disobedience. You couldn't turn out people like this otherwise.
This is the President's last day in Peking. He leaves for Hangzhou tomorrow, and he is host at an official banquet, which is shortly to begin.
If these pictures look familiar to you, they should. Almost everything is identical to the banquet the Chinese had given the Americans 4 nights earlier. Because the United States had no relations of any kind with China, it had to use the same location, the same waiters, the same tables, and the same cooks as the Chinese. The only thing changed was the menu.
The President flew from Peking to Hangzhou with the premier in a Chinese aircraft, a Soviet-made Ilyushin 18, a prop jet. The Chinese had insisted that President Nixon ride one of their aircraft instead of his own. The White House claims President Nixon had the capability, through his own communications suitcase aboard the Chinese plane, to remain in touch with Washington or anywhere else in the world at all times. No U.S. president had ever before flown any great distance in the aircraft of a foreign government. Reports circulated that he and Premier Joe had been busily talking aboard the plane on the way down. News Secretary Ronald Ziegler immediately confirmed that a communique had been worked out.
If there are agreements on basic substantive issues in the communique, then those would have been reached.
The President and Premier Joe, both now appearing to be in reasonably good humor, toured Hangzhou's West Lake. It seemed clear that there would be no additional meeting with Chairman Mao. In one of the lake's parks, the President and the Premier fed giant goldfish, in perhaps the most beautiful setting in which they have been photographed during this week in China. The President had indicated he did not want to banter with reporters, but he finally relented.
The sightseeing I've had is like the hors d'oeuvre of a Chinese dinner. I'd like to have more.
How is the entree?
This is the hors d'oeuvre. I'd like to come back to see it. I mean, to do the sightseeing. But the Prime Minister and I have been a little busy on occasion, so we haven't had quite the time for sightseeing. We were doing things that were more important.
Today in Shanghai, the industrial exhibition is the pride of China's biggest city, and there, overlooked by the founders of communism, Marx and Engels, the party surveyed the treasures of the revolution, the heavy machinery, the technology that has made China unequal among superpowers. And there, under the benign gaze of the chairman, the President and Premier discussed not revolution or ideology, but the ancient battle of the sexes.
But in the home, the woman is always more intelligent than the husband.
因为在家庭事务上，总是女人比男人更聪明。
不见得。
Not necessarily.
In Shanghai, the President and Premier Zhou Enlai issued a communique proclaiming their desire for peaceful coexistence between their two countries. It spoke, as expected, of the prospect of exchanging athletes, scientists, cultural groups, journalists in future, so that the Chinese and Americans can get to know each other better. It spoke of the U.S. intention to phase out its troops from Taiwan, but the spirit of the communique was most eloquently expressed by the President in his final toast at yet another banquet, the last one, in Shanghai.
Prime Minister, our two peoples tonight hold the future of the world in our hands. And as we think of that future, we are dedicated to the principle that we can build a new world, a world of peace, a world of justice, a world of independence for all nations.
Richard Nixon may be no wiser about China than he was a week ago, but it should be apparent to people everywhere now that neither Peking nor Washington is inhabited by saints or devils, just ordinary, fallible people.
The success of that historic week in China in February of 1972 left Richard Nixon riding high. But the following June, his presidency began to unravel, though no one understood it fully at the time. And just as Vietnam had figured prominently in his discussions in Beijing, so too the Vietnam War and the deep divisions it caused in this country ultimately led to one of the greatest political crises in American history, Watergate. What destroyed the Nixon presidency didn't begin with a burglary in the late spring of '72. It began here at Richard Nixon's inaugural in the winter of 1969. His great triumph spoiled by anti-Vietnam War demonstrators.
Serve, protect, and defend.
The seeds for Watergate were planted on this day in a rage that would lead to a terrible end.
There were many people in the city that were protesting the war. They were visible to some people on the edge of the parade route, and it did set a fairly tense mood at the time that I think carried through for quite some time thereafter.
There was a secret government. There was a secret attitude of hate that was directed at the press and the Democrats and the people who opposed the Vietnam War.
Within 5 months of his inauguration, Richard Nixon would authorize wiretaps on men inside his own administration because he believed they were subverting his efforts in Vietnam by leaking damaging stories to the press. And as the leaks continued, Nixon came to believe that those leaks were sabotaging his foreign policy. Then came the granddaddy of all leaks, the Pentagon Papers. On June 13, 1971, the New York Times published the first part of a classified Defense Department study leaked by former analyst Daniel Elkin, detailing the hidden history of the Vietnam War.
One of the decisive moments in the escalation of Watergate from resentment, paranoia, siege mentality to crossing the line, right, was a couple of meetings I was in when Nixon, in absolute frustration, and somewhat justified, in my view, was pounding the desk in the Oval Office saying, we've got to do something to stop these expletive deleted leaks. I want those classified documents protected.
And that's where the plumbers began.
That's where the plumbers started.
The plumbers, the secret organization put together by the White House to plug press leaks by any means necessary. One of Richard Nixon's closest aides, John Ehrlichman, was put in overall charge of the unit. Working for the plumbers were former CIA agent Howard Hunt and former FBI agent Gordon Liddy. But the head plumber was White House aide Eagle Crow.
I think this was the beginning of a series of events that took place over the next 2 years that led to the downfall of that administration, because we stepped over the line for what we thought were good and sufficient reasons at the time
in retrospect, they were neither good nor were they sufficient. And it wasn't just a mistake, it was a serious crime.
But beyond the president's obsession with leaks, it was plain and simple politics that inevitably put the Nixon White House on the road to Watergate. Nixon's popularity was ebbing, and the Democrats felt they had a genuine shot at the White House next time around. The front runner at the time was Senator Edmund Muskie of Maine, but the White House preferred a different candidate.
McGovern was the candidate that, beginning in January, when I was tracking all the polls and would study the poll data daily, he was the one candidate that we wanted more than anything else, but never dreamt would ever get nominated.
In their effort to help McGovern's campaign and undermine Muskie, the White House orchestrated a series of dirty tricks, false letters, bogus allegations, all designed to damage Muskie in the eyes of his fellow Democrats.
You have to go back and realize at the time how astonishing it was to learn that really reprehensible dirty tricks were financed by the president's personal attorney, that the guy doing it, Donald Segretti, had been recruited not by Howard Hunt or Gordon Liddy, but by Dwight Chapin, the president's appointment secretary.
By late spring, Ed Muskie was finished, and the Republicans got the opponent they wanted, George McGovern. But the dirty tricks campaign against the Democrats was far from over.
The Watergate break-in really came from a series of meetings, believe it or not, and it's hard to believe even now, in the Attorney General's office, John Mitchell, chief law enforcement officer of the land, the deputy Nixon campaign manager, Jeb Magruder, the president's counsel, John Dean, and Gordon Liddy, kind of the operations manager of dirty tricks and intelligence gathering for the Nixon campaign. And there were 3 meetings in which Liddy outlined all of the intelligence gathering that's legal and illegal.
On June 17, 1972, in the dead of night, a group of men working for the committee to re-elect Richard Nixon president broke into the offices of the Democratic National Committee here at the Watergate office complex. The lead burglar was James McCord, a former agent for the CIA. The ringleaders were Gordon Liddy, a former FBI agent, and Howard Hunt, also former CIA.
Our command post, as it were, was in a room in the Watergate Hotel, which is a building adjacent to the Watergate office complex. And it was from there that the 4 Cubans and Jim McCord left to go into the Watergate office building.
What were they looking for? Part of the confusion stems from the little-known fact that there were 2 break-ins. The first, earlier break-in, actually went undetected. But when the burglars discovered that one of the wiretaps they had planted wasn't working, they went in a second time to make sure they could listen to the conversations of the Democratic National Chairman.
The first indication that there might have been some break-in came about when a guard came down and saw that there was tape on the door. He had remembered that carpenters or other workers had been in the building earlier that day, and he thought they put it on. So he removed the tape. McCord, who was the one who put the tape on, going out on one occasion, sees the tapes removed, and he runs back and he calls Liddy. And he says, "They found us out. The tape's been removed."
And at that point I said, "Let's scratch it." And Liddy objected. "Let's go. Everybody's here. We got the team assembled. We've all come up from Miami. McCord's here. Go." So they went. Filed off into history.
The lights on the 8th floor at the Watergate complex across the street here immediately were turned off.
In the early morning of June 17th, Al Baldwin's job was to act as lookout for the Watergate burglars.
3 individuals appeared on the 6th floor, the Democratic National Headquarters. These 3 individuals dressed in casual clothes, guns drawn. I immediately, on the walkie-talkie, said, "Well, we've got problems." Within moments, another communication comes over the walkie-talkie. "They've got us."
About 4 o'clock that morning, I received a telephone call at home from my office saying there had been a burglary at the Watergate apartments, and the police had been called. And I said, rather sleepily, Why are you bothering me about that? That's not anything the FBI has jurisdiction over. That's a local burglary. Call the police. And he said, no, boss, it's a little different. He said they found some little round things with wires.
So one reason they went in was to plant wiretaps so they could bug the conversations of the Democratic High Command. But what else were the burglars looking for? FBI agent Daniel Mayen spent 3 years investigating the entire operation.
I think the paranoia of the White House and Republicans at that time was to such a level that they were afraid that Mr. Nixon would be defeated that coming fall. And they were looking for anything and everything they could do to facilitate his reelection. And that's the reason they were in there. That's the only reason they were.
From the beginning, the Watergate break-in wasn't treated as just another burglary by the Washington Post.
The phone rings, and it's the city editor at the Post saying there's been a burglary at the Democratic headquarters. Could I come in? It's Saturday. I'm not scheduled to work. I'd like to salute. So I did.
I heard what had happened. I told the city editor that I'd like to make some calls because I was kind of known as being okay at using the phones. I called the Watergate, started talking to bellmen, started talking to desk clerks, started finding out a little bit about these guys.
And the mystery kept compounding itself. 5 burglars, business suits, rubber gloves, $100 bills in their pockets, sophisticated photographic equipment. James McCord turned out to be the head of the burglary team. The judge asked him, are you employed? And McCord whispered that he had worked or did work at the CIA.
So immediately you say,
not your average burglar.
And not your average story, at least in the beginning. It attracted national coverage.
After the break-in was detected, 5 men were discovered crouched around this receptionist's desk and were arrested at gunpoint. Here and in the men's rooms in the adjoining hotel, police confiscated extensive photographic and electronic eavesdropping gear, as well as several $1,000s in consecutively numbered bills. Of those arrested, most interest has centered on James McCord of Rockville, Maryland. McCord was once an FBI agent, then worked for 20 years as a security officer for the Central Intelligence Agency.
James McCord, Jr., one of the 5 men arrested here yesterday morning, lives in a handsome home in a comfortable suburban neighborhood. He runs McCord Associates, located in this fancy new office building, and apparently he has a lot of clients. Senator Robert Dole says he provides security services for the Republican National Committee. John Mitchell says he works for the Committee for the Re-election of President Nixon, where they pay him over $1,000 a month.
Former Attorney General John Mitchell now heads the committee to re-elect President Nixon. He was in Los Angeles this weekend to attend a series of parties hosted by well-to-do Republicans. KNXT reporter Jake Jacobs attempted to question Mr. Mitchell.
Could I ask you about Mr. McCord, sir, and your knowledge of what was happening?
Any more about it? You've read in the papers.
The cover-up had begun. The day after the break-in, the president placed a call to White House aide Chuck Colson.
I said to the president, it may be that some of these guys had ties to the committee to re-elect the president. He, at that point, launched into a series of...
Wait a minute. Some of these guys who broke in had ties to the CRP.
To the committee to re-elect the president. Nixon said nobody in our operation could be that stupid. He said that's the blankety-blank thing I've ever heard in my life. Was furious and said that he had smashed an ashtray when someone had told him that our people had something to do with it.
On June 23rd, 6 days after the break-in, Richard Nixon spent part of his day making a film for the upcoming Republican convention. This would turn out to be the most fateful day of his presidency.
Get early. See you around? Yes, sir. He's upstairs.
That morning, away from the cameras, Chief of Staff H.R. Bob Haldeman received an urgent phone call from White House counsel John Dean. Notes from that conversation say, investigation out of control. Gray looking for a way out. Dean and Haldeman were discussing the FBI, which by this time had traced the $100 bills found on the Watergate burglars to Mexico, and were about to trace that money back to Richard Nixon's re-election committee. Again, from Haldeman's notes, call Walters in. Have him talk to FBI Director Gray. After that phone call, Haldeman met with the president and then with the CIA Director Richard Helms and his second-in-command, Vernon Walters. At that meeting, Haldeman asked them to interfere with the FBI investigation.
And it was quite clear from the beginning of the meeting that there was a certain hostility going on here. And that they wanted Walters to go down and see the acting director, Gray, of the FBI, and to indicate to him that he should knock off, if you like, an investigation in Mexico because it might run into some of CIA's operations in Mexico.
In effect, the CIA was being told to block the FBI investigation. Walters did pay a visit to Gray, a visit that, in the end, resulted in a series of memos between the two men, agreeing that each agency had a responsibility to protect the president from his own people. This misuse of the CIA, a blatant obstruction of justice, would ultimately prove to be the act that brought down Richard Nixon. From the beginning, White House strategy had been designed to contain the Watergate investigation, keep it at the lowest level possible. And at least in the beginning, that strategy seemed to work.
In Miami, Bernard Barker watched on television with his attorney, Henry Rothblatt, as the federal indictments were handed down.
Barker and his four fellow Watergate burglars, plus E. Howard Hunt and Gordon Liddy, were the only men implicated when federal indictments were handed down in September. The White House was jubilant. White House counsel John Dean was singled out for his efforts at squelching the investigation.
The president told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the president was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy.
In the meantime, the Washington Post was beginning to pull together the threads that would eventually lead to the heart of the Nixon presidency. They were helped by an anonymous source known to Americans only as Deep Throat, who told them to follow the money.
I frankly have a better appreciation of it now than I did at the time. The lead from Deep Throat, follow the money. So important on this story. And we followed the money.
And the money trail soon led them to Hugh Sloan, who, as treasurer of Nixon's re-election committee, had access to a huge secret cash fund. Cash, so it couldn't be traced to the re-election committee. Cash that was being used for bribes and payoffs.
Hugh Sloan was somebody who had quit at this time, didn't like what he saw, didn't know what it all meant, but said to us that there was a cash fund of $500,000, maybe $700,000, and he would make disbursements under the authority of certain people. Very key, follow the money, who controls the money. And our stories in the Washington Post before the '72 election focused on this secret fund and who controlled it, and the key people were Haldeman, Stans, and Mitchell.
Bob Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff, Maurice Stans, former Commerce Secretary, Treasurer of the Nixon campaign, John Mitchell, former Attorney General, former Chairman of the Nixon Campaign Committee.
And how much do you think that publicity attending this case is hurting President Nixon's re-election campaign?
Not in the slightest. I don't believe it'll hurt in the slightest for the very simple reason that neither the president, obviously, or anybody in the White House, or anybody in authority in any of the committees working for the re-election of the president have any responsibility for it.
11:30 at night, 12:30 at night, Carl Bernstein calls the Attorney General of the United States at home and tells him what?
Well, he said that they were running the story that Mitchell controlled that money and said they wanted to check this story with him.
Mm-hmm.
He said, well, are you going to run this? And if you are, Katie Graham's tit is going to get caught in a ringer. There you are. I said it.
We reflected on the Attorney General's remark about where Mrs. Graham's arrangements were going to get caught, and we thought that they were serious about that. As it turned out, they sure as hell were.
Well, were there actual things undertaken by the White House to get back at you people?
you know that Florida, that the FCC had this rule that all television license has to be renewed every 3 years. In the state of Florida, the Post owned 2 television stations, neither of which had ever been challenged in the history of television. Right. And suddenly there were 3 or 4 challenges, including Rebozo, including all the representatives of the Florida Committee to re-elect.
B.B. Rebozo?
B.B. Rebozo.
Richard Nixon's best friend.
Richard Nixon's best friend.
We were hurting. We'd written all of these things. Lots of people didn't believe them. We were out on one long limb. And there were lots of saws working on that limb.
And no one is with you. I mean, no one.
In October, there was, we had one ally.
Walter Cronkite.
Walter Cronkite.
At first, it was called the Watergate Caper. 5 men, apparently caught in the act of burglarizing and bugging Democratic headquarters in Washington. But the episode grew steadily more sinister.
It wasn't up until your network gave 15 minutes of airtime to our stories in late October that our reporting got any prominence. Our colleagues in the press ignored us or disbelieved us.
It was a big kiss from Walter. It was
Bill Paley, the CBS equivalent of Katharine Graham, was not particularly happy about it.
Oh, yeah. Bill Paley called me many times. I remember one Saturday morning in the fall of '72 and apologized for a 13-minute news segment on Watergate, which he said was in the middle of a political campaign, was violating the fairness doctrine. He said, I've been talking to the news department trying to change them, and he said, I'm having difficulty, but trust me, I'll keep working on it.
The committee to re-elect the
To
president.
the point where the second scheduled story the next night was edited almost in half.
I went through life saying this is the purest form of journalism in which I've ever worked, including magazines and newspapers. I had to back off of that when I learned the truth about the Watergate episode, since clearly top management had interfered with the broadcast.
The truth is, despite the Washington Post and despite CBS News, Watergate had no impact whatsoever on the election results that fall.
The Nixon landslide that was predicted seems to be turning into a reality.
He got reelected, and that's the American way. No one had, it didn't change our conviction that something was rotten, but it slowed down our ability to do anything about it. We couldn't get it.
And so it was that in 1972, the 4th year of his presidency, we saw the best and the worst of that complicated political creature, Richard Milhous Nixon. It is almost impossible to believe that the man capable of such noble pursuits in foreign policy as the beginning of relations with communist China was the same man who committed the squalid deeds that violated his oath of office and ultimately led to his resignation in disgrace. Richard Nixon was, as Winston Churchill once described Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. I'm Mike Wallace, and this is the 20th century.